Hi, my name's Kath Murphy and I'm from Greater Manchester Autism Consortium.
Hi, I'm Hazel Lerry and I'm also from Greater Manchester Autism Consortium.
I've been working with GMAC now for about 8 months and I work as a parent facilitator, so mainly working on the managing anger and sensory needs webinars that we have. We also do drop-ins for parents with children who have autism, mainly online at the moment still, unfortunately. Hopefully we're hoping to do face-to-face again later on in the year. So my background is in teacher education and I also have 2 grandsons who are on the autistic spectrum.
Hi, I've been with GMAC just over the last year, mostly working on the implementation groups that are putting into practice Greater Manchester's autism friendly strategy. But as well as that, I've been really pleased to be able to help with a few of the parent seminars recently. So I'm really pleased to be here. My background is in autism is as a teacher. So for, I suppose, just under 40 years, I've been teaching children, autistic children in different settings, some special schools and specialist settings, but also mainstream schools as well. Mostly primary age group, but a little bit of experience with older children as well. So I'm really pleased to be here with you.
Okay, so the aims for this evening or for this session are to increase awareness of autism and also to discuss some of the different features of autism. It could be that you maybe have just want to find out more about the condition, or it may be that you have concerns that your child or somebody you know may be on the autistic spectrum and want to find out more. So although the session will be recorded, please be aware or please be reassured that in accordance with safeguarding regulations, none of the information that's disclosed in the chat function at the end, when we are here for kind of any question and answers you may have, so none of that information will be shared with a third party. So what is autism? It's a lifelong developmental disability which affects how people communicate and interact in the world. 1 in 100 people are on the autism spectrum, and there are around 700,000 autistic adults and children in the UK. It's a spectrum condition and affects people in different ways. And like all people, autistic people have their own strengths and difficulties.
We thought it would be useful to look at some of the strengths and difficulties that autistic people might experience. And as Kath has said, every autistic person is different, but there are some common features that it would be useful to have a look at with you. So in terms of strengths, we often find that an autistic child or an autistic person can be really, really good at memorizing specific information and also a lot of detail, and that this can be a real strength for them. They tend also to think and learn in a very visual way, which again can be useful as long as the people around them understand that. They also are very logical thinkers because of the way in which autism affects them. They tend to think in very straightforward, logical ways that for many of us, we sort of forget how illogical the way that the neurotypical brain is until you meet autistic people. And this can lead them to also be people who are really good at what we would call thinking outside the box. So they might really help those of us who aren't autistic to see things in a very different way through the way in which they think. In GMAC, in the implementation groups, we're working with a group of autistic entrepreneurs, and it just shows the way in which they have used their autistic strengths to create businesses and ideas that many people just wouldn't have thought of. Autistic people are also very typically very reliable in terms of regard to schedules and routines, because those things are very important to them. They value them a lot in their lives. And so they are very reliable in that sense. They also tend to be very good at concentrating for long periods of time, particularly when they're motivated by something. And you'll find that an autistic child or an autistic person will have a very focused way of working. In terms of difficulties, we can't underestimate sometimes how difficult life can be for an autistic child or an autistic person, despite all those strengths. And one of the main areas that they will struggle with is understanding and interacting with other people socially. They'll find it difficult to understand another person's perspective and how that person feels. And if you think about the number of interactions we have over a day, if that is difficult for you, then socially, that is a huge challenge for you going through day-to-day business. As we've said, that an autistic person will like routines, and they'll be very, very important to them apart from just liking them. And therefore, if there's changes in routine or sudden changes of plan, particularly if it's short notice or no time for preparation, that can be really upsetting and distressing for an autistic person. Whereas for most of us, it would be an annoyance. It can be something that would really set an autistic person back in their day. They can also be I suppose the difficulty side of their very focused thinking is that they can also be quite rigid in their thinking at times and find it difficult to shift their viewpoint or to shift how they see something. And sometimes we talk about a person becoming obsessed with something, and it means that they can't stop a thought pattern, and it just keeps coming round and round in their mind and in their head, and it's really difficult for them to move off that track. Autistic people also have considerable sensory differences, and this will varies from person to person, and Kath is going to say a lot more about this later on. But this is something that, you know, in the time that I was working with autistic children early on, we didn't recognize at all, I'm ashamed to say. We just hadn't realized the impact of the sensory differences that autistic people experienced. And we're understanding that more and more as more research is done. But it will be, an autistic person is likely to perceive the world around them in a very different way from a neurotypical person, a person who isn't autistic. For some people, that can be at times very overwhelming. Again, it will be very different from person to person, but also from day to day. So what somebody can cope with one day, they can't cope with another day, much like any of us. You know, if we're having a bad day, then the things that trouble us or that are difficult for us will be even more troublesome and difficult. And because of all those things, autistic people will also suffer from higher levels of anxiety in many cases. And this is something I think to always bear in mind if you know somebody who's autistic, or if you're caring for somebody who's autistic, because all those differences and difficulties, if you think of them happening day after day, day in, day out, all day, build up huge amounts of stress for an autistic person who's trying to operate in a world that really isn't geared up to their needs. And so this can result in very high levels of anxiety.
So there are quite a few terms that you might have heard of to describe autism spectrum disorder. And I'm just going to go through some of them now, just to kind of briefly explain what they're about, and in case you've actually heard some of these terms as well. So there's ASC, which is autism spectrum condition. There's PDA, which is pathological demand avoidance. And this is about the avoidance of everyday demands and the use of social strategies as part of that avoidance. So somebody might kind of avoid carrying out normal day-to-day functions and so on. There's SPD, which is sensory processing disorder. And that's a disorder that can affect how the brain processes sensory information. In other words, the stimuli that causes those sensory reactions. And what I'm going to do shortly after Hazel's talked about communication is I'm going to talk about some of the sensory issues that people with autism can have. There's Asperger's. That's quite a well-known one, or one that's quite commonly heard of. And people with Asperger's syndrome, don't have the learning difficulties that many autistic people have, but they may have some specific learning difficulties. So they can be sometimes what's called HFA, high functioning autism. So they might be academically very, very bright, very clever, but then have like different social needs, for example, and different sensory needs as well. High functioning autism isn't an official diagnosis, and nor is there an agreed upon definition of actually what the term means, but you may hear even professionals referring to HFA. Apologies for all the acronyms, by the way. I know they can be a bit annoying. And then there's also PDD, which is pervasive development disorder. And that's a group of disorders which are characterized by delays in the development of socialization and communication skills. Now, since 2013, all of these have come under the umbrella term of ASD, which is autism spectrum disorder. And that's what we'll refer to for the rest of this session here. So just to kind of talk about some myths and facts that you might have heard of about ASD. So quite a common one: boys are more likely than girls to have ASD. That's quite a common statement that's made. According to the NHS, the Mental Health of Children and Young People in England, 2017, boys are 3 times more likely than girls to be diagnosed with ASD. However, it's worthwhile noting that one of the traits that girls have is that they are actually better at masking some of their perhaps social difficulties and so on. Girls tend to be very good at sitting and watching and perhaps copying behaviours, so that people don't necessarily notice that they have any differences in social needs. So they quite often go undetected. And you will find that there's an awful lot of adults who are diagnosed with autism are actually females who have come to that suspicion about themselves, or that realization, actually through taking their children through a diagnosis process. Another myth that you may have heard: ASD is a rare condition. In actual fact, 1 in 100 people in the UK have ASD. So that's 700,000 people. There's about 70 million population in the UK at the moment. So that's quite a huge number, really. I've also heard it said that ASD is something that a child grows out of. Unfortunately, no. It's a lifelong development disability, and it's not something that a child may grow out of. In fact, I would describe it almost the opposite, that it's something that a child grows into, because the older, this is from my own experience, when my grandchildren, the older they have gotten, the more obvious their traits have become in actual fact, or more pronounced those traits have appeared to be. Do you want to talk about some of the myths, Hazel?
Yeah, you might have heard people talk about ASD being a new thing, But in fact, it's well over 50 years. In fact, I think it's nearly 80 years since Leo Kanner first described what he called autism and autistic behaviour. So it's not new in any sense of the word. And there's been since that time continued research which really helps our understanding of autism. And I would say put that alongside as well the growing voice of autistic people and their families in explaining what life is like and how things feel for them has increased our understanding hugely in recent years, I would say, by actually listening to those people. There's also still the idea that autistic children behave badly. You might hear that sort of thing being said, and it's absolutely not the case. But that isn't to deny that autistic children can be very challenging and present very challenging behaviour, which is difficult for themselves, but particularly difficult for their families. It can also happen in school, but the families clearly they're on their own with the children. It's a much more challenging situation for them. But I think it's really unhelpful to say things like, he or she is behaving badly. And it's much more useful to look at the behaviour as probably a last resort in terms of the child communicating something to the people around them. And if we think again back to the many, many social and sensory issues that the child might be experiencing on a day-to-day basis, it's hardly surprising that every so often they find it really difficult to sort of contain their behaviour. And a lot of families talk about it as a child having a meltdown, because that's how it feels. But I think it's most helpful to look at their behaviour in terms of communication. What's this about? And we need to try and get to the bottom of it.
Another
Does that
myth
cover that?
Absolutely, no, that
yeah.
was really good. Yeah. Another myth you may have heard of is that ASD is down to bad parenting. Definitely not. It really isn't at all. The strong evidence suggests that autism can be caused by a variety of physical factors, all of which affect brain development. It's not due to emotional deprivation or the way a person's being brought up. And evidence suggests that autism may be genetic. So there is a possibility that it can be passed down through families. They're still kind of working on that one a little bit. Scientists have been attempting to identify which genes might be implicated for quite a few years, and it's likely to have multiple genes responsible rather than a single gene. But I can't stress enough to you that it's absolutely not down to bad parenting in any way whatsoever. And I know I'm biased, but I happen to think both my daughters are pretty good mothers. But that their children from each family has ASD, and it's simply down to a difference in kind of their behaviours and so on. So there are four main differences, and we're going to kind of talk about both of them, or all four really, but in two kind of separate sections. So the first one is about social communication and then social interaction, both of which Hazel's going to speak to you about in a few moments. And then I'm going to talk about kind of behaviours and sensory, or focusing very much more on the sensory difficulties. Just before we start on that, I'd like to show you a short video clip that actually explains quite neatly how autism occurs and some of the kind of happy sides to the condition as well. So I'm going to just bear with me 1 second while I bring this up.
We are all different, and that's wonderful. Some differences are easy to see. Height, hairstyle, gender, eye color, and so on. Other differences can't be seen. Our favorite foods, fears, or special skills. Interestingly, the way we see the world is also different. For instance, what do you see in this drawing? Most people see a duck, but some of you might have seen a rabbit. Whichever you saw, you are correct. This is just a trick drawing to show you that all brains work differently. The brain is your body's computer. It works differently for all of us and controls how you learn. That's why we are all good at different things. How you feel, which is why we all feel different emotions. And how you communicate. Sometimes the brain is connected in such a way it affects the senses and how we perceive and read situations and interactions. This is known as autism. Many people have autism, so it's likely you already know someone who is autistic. And for this reason, it's useful to know a little bit about autism. The special wiring inside an autistic brain can sometimes make the person good at tasks we may find difficult, such as mathematics, drawing, or music. It can also do the opposite, and activities we find too easy are incredibly difficult to them, such as making friends. The senses constantly send information to your brain about your surroundings and other people. However, when a person's brain and its senses don't communicate well, the brain can become overwhelmed and confused, affecting how they see the world. Picture yourself walking down the street. This is how an autistic brain may experience the same walk. Scary, isn't it? Sadly, in many cases, the person can't say out loud how they feel. So even though there's chaos going on in their heads, they seem okay on the outside, unable to ask for help. We all develop behaviors to help us feel calm in uncomfortable situations. We may look away, hug ourselves, chew our fingernails, fidget, bite our lips, and so on. Equally, autistic people develop behaviors that help them cope with these intense moments. These actions may seem unusual, but they're just their way to feel calm. When they happen, it means they are having a hard time. The kind thing to do is not to give them an even harder time by getting cross, ignoring them, or mocking them. Remember, just because a PlayStation can't read an Xbox game, it doesn't mean it's broken. People with autism need friends who are willing to take the time to know them. With good communication and plenty of patience, everyone would be better off. People with autism are not ill or broken. They simply have a unique view of the world. And with a little support from their friends, they might just be able to share that view with us. Autism can make amazing things happen.
So it's quite a nice video clip, really, just to give some of the outlines of what autism is about and so on. So I'm going to hand over to Hazel now, who's going to talk to you about supporting communication.
Okay, yes. So communication is going to be one of the most important things to look at, along with the sensory issues, in terms of how to make life easier and more positive for an autistic person. And particularly if we're thinking about children here, I'm just going to go through a few things that considered to be good practice in terms of helping an autistic child to communicate and to develop their understanding and communication skills. So one of the first things, and a really simple thing to do, is to use the child's name or the person's name before you say whatever you want to say. And this may seem like overkill in a way when you hear yourself saying the name over and over again, but it truly does help a lot of autistic children particularly, but adults as well, I think. And we often used to have children in school who would be unable to take in the group instructions that are so often given in a classroom. You know, say, everyone put your books away and go in the playground, and you'd turn around and the autistic child might still be sitting there busy doing their work or whatever, and they've not taken in the fact that they belong to the term everyone. So they often need to have their name put in front of any sort of instruction or just start of a conversation. The other important thing when to aid understanding is to give one instruction at a time or one piece of information at a time. I think we're probably worse at it in schools of giving a whole string of instructions in one go, and then most children, let alone autistic children, will probably only remember the last thing that was said. So it's really important to break instructions and information down into individual blocks. Another really useful tip is to use positive language, which I'm sure you're all familiar with anyway, but to try and focus on what you want the child to do rather than what you don't want them to do. And again, a sort of very basic example of this is if a child is displaying challenging behaviour and is going to, you're worried they're going to hit somebody nearby. One of the worst things you can say is don't hit, because in the state that child is in, they're going to hear the word hit and think, yes, that's what I'm doing, you know. Whereas if you say something like hands down, it gives them a direct thing to do with their hands that in doing that means then they're much less likely to actually hit any, you know, as quickly as they would have done. You might be able to get in quickly before it happens. So try to use fewer words as well and simple language. If you think the child is struggling, try and break your language down into just the basics of what's needed. And give, it can sometimes you feel as though you're being a bit, if it's not your child and you're talking to somebody else, it might feel as though you're being a bit impolite or a bit rude, but actually it's really helpful for an autistic person to have very direct language spoken to them. With young children, if they're struggling, break it down into just 2 words, you know, coat on, that sort of thing, or juice or milk, you know, your 2 choices. So really breaking it down. Always be aware, I mean, we all have to do this, of the level, the pitch and the level of volume of our voice, because for some autistic children and people, a tiny increase in volume can feel huge to them and has a very sort of negative effect on them. So however hard it is, we have to sort of try to use very sort of calm voice tone and pitch as well. I can remember teaching a child who really struggled when he moved to a new teacher because he just couldn't cope with the teacher's voice. And it was a really tricky situation because she'd sort of developed her teacher voice, you know, to fill the whole school hall with 100 children in it, whatever. And he really struggled with the volume and the tone of that voice. So it is something to think about. Eye contact is a big one as well, because we tend to get very hung up on eye contact and try, I mean, I can remember in my sort of earlier days teaching, it was really considered important to teach children to use good eye contact when they're communicating. But we know that for autistic children, that can be really challenging for them. Some people even talk of it feeling painful to them to have to use eye contact. So in the early days, I would say, you know, the best thing is to not make a big deal of it. Quite often a child might appear to be not focused on what you're saying at all, but in fact they're taking it all in, even though they're sort of looking across at something else and you think, oh, they're not with me at all, but they are. So to really try not to make a big thing of eye contact, but at some point, we quite often try and teach young people how to sort of get around that issue. And perhaps some autistic people I know look at somebody's shoulder or something like that, and they can manage that, or always look just behind the person, and then it gives an appearance of eye contact, which gets them through social situations. But that can be a real issue for people. And I think the best thing with children particularly is to not make a big issue of it. Another thing is to use visual support, and I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in a minute, because that can be really useful in supporting communication. But a big thing to say is to always allow time to process. We in school, I can't remember what the count was. Is it, do you know, Kath, is it 3 seconds or is it more? But you're supposed to ask a question to a child and then you need to just be quiet for at least a good 3 seconds to allow them to process and give their answer. Because particularly in schools, and I mean, maybe at home, if you're in a rush and things, the temptation is to say the question again, or even worse, from an autistic person's point of view, rephrase it, because sometimes that can be more confusing for them. So always allow time to process, and it will feel a long time at first, but you'll see how it works. Another thing that I've heard a lot of autistic adults, I suppose, say is that as children, it would be really useful if they'd have the rules explained to them. So there might be rules at home for particular things. I mean, there's always rules in school for particular things, but to really explain why it's in place. And if they understand why it's in place, then they will follow them because that is what they want to do. But if they really don't understand the rule, it won't occur to them to follow it. And as a teacher, I mean, that was a really good challenge because it made us teachers really think which rules were needed and which weren't. So I mentioned visual support, and this is something that can make a huge difference to an autistic person, to sort of provide structure for them. So you can think about that in terms of their environment. So by making their environment clear as to what should be done in which place. So in the home situation, it might be about making it really clear, you know, this is where you sit down when we're going to eat, or this is where you sit down when you can watch telly, or this is where you can sit to look at your books or whatever. It might be that people need to make that clear to a child to avoid difficulties at home. And in school, the same sort of thing goes on, making it really clear in the classroom, you know, this is where you put your water bottle, this, you know, a place for everything. I think that's the motto as well, to try and have a really sort of organized environment for the child. So a lot of what we need to explain to an autistic child is what we want them to do or what they're going to do. And a lot of the way to do this is to use, you can use objects to signal events. So you might always use your car keys if it means you're going in the car, or a coat if it means we're going outside. Might have a particular cup that means, right, it's time for lunch or whatever. Or it might be that the child responds well to photos that show them what's going to happen, or symbols. I've just done a very rough copy of things that we've used in schools for this sort of thing to show, I don't know if you can see that, but shows, say, what we want the child to do now and then next. This wouldn't be a school one because it's very rare to get them brushing their teeth in school. But say at home, if you wanted a child to brush their teeth and they're really not keen at all, you know, now brush your teeth, next you can have the iPad or whatever the treat is. And these things, if it works with a child, then we always recommend that you make them with Velcro or something, or these are just blue tack, but make it so that you can stick them on and off, and put what you need on when you need it. And the other thing is that I just printed these off the internet, but you can easily draw or use photos. As a child, if a child is more able to think further ahead, you might want a whole sequence of things. So for instance, this is a morning routine. We use things a lot like this in school, but I know a lot of families find these things helpful too. So, you know, your breakfast, brush your teeth, coat on. This child's going by scooter to school, and then school. And obviously you can have as much as you want. And then the other thing is sort of how to do it. So it might be that for brushing teeth, it might need to be broken down, say, into get toothbrush, toothpaste on, brush teeth, water, you know, a list of things that need to be done in order to actually explain how it works. And these things can be incredibly helpful and can prevent those tussles with a child, you know, trying to get them to brush their teeth, which I know can be really, really hard. Another important thing for autistic people is to indicate how long something is going to last. For a lot of children, particularly, they find it really difficult to stop things that they really enjoy, as do most children. But for an autistic child, that can be a real cliff edge moment. So if you can find a way of showing them how much time they've got on a favorite activity, that's a really good idea. And you can use things like a timer on an iPad, you know, with a countdown, and maybe let them choose the little jingle at the end so that it's something that you know they like. Or just one of those sand egg timers, that sort of thing. You can get them, I think, for different lengths of time. Or a phone alarm, whatever you think will work best for a child. And yes, I've talked about what happens next. It's always good for an autistic person to know what's going to happen next. It's not supportive for them to have a sort of vagueness about what's going to happen through the day. For a lot of autistic people, it's really important for them to know what's going to happen through their day. And with all these things, I'm going to ask Kath to share something in a minute, because with all these things, it's important to just get them, you can put them at whatever level the child needs. So they might be much more able to cope with a lot more information than the little list that I showed you here. And we can use visual support at any level. And Kath's got an example of as what we'd call a social story, something that I think, did you use it with one of your grandchildren?
I did, yes, yeah.
So to explain it in a minute, and this is a really good technique for autistic children, but for any children, to be honest, to explain a situation. If it's, I mean, you can use them for, you know, nice situations as well, but particularly in a situation that a child finds difficult or where they've struggled, this is a visual way of talking it through. And quite often you would do it at a later time when things have calmed down, but I'll let Kath talk this one through and explain it.
Yeah, I'll just explain it quickly to you. Just as a brief background, social stories were devised by a lady called Carol Gray in the 1990s. And they can be used exactly as Hazel said in two ways. So you can use them kind of after an event has happened. So in this case, my grandson Alfie, who was 6 at the time, had a meltdown because he'd lost at a board game we were playing. And it resulted in him throwing things across the room and so on. And I quickly, as you can see, I'm not the world's best artist, but I quickly did this kind of comic strip social story for him. So I kind of wrote out, you know, what had happened. We're playing payday and we're all very happy. And then Alfie loses some money in the game and he starts getting unhappy. And then he throws his counter across the room, won't play the game anymore, and how everybody was very upset about that. And then we kind of end up not really winning the game, not really finishing the game. Alfie doesn't join in for the rest of the game, and Nana and Jamie carried on playing and so on. And that was the sad story. And then what I did was rewrote it with Alfie, and we did a happy version of the story, and kind of basically just talked through kind of how things might be different had he reacted in a different way. And, you know, how we talked about it's okay because it's just part of the game, and how even though you don't win, you know, you could still have fun and enjoy yourself. So those are just something that can be used sometimes. You can also use them in advance of a situation. So if, for example, you've got a social situation, say a family wedding coming up or something like that, and you think this is going to be really stressful for the child, you could use a social story with the child, kind of setting out the events of what's going to happen, but then use it to actually talk to the child about, well, what do you think, how do you think we should behave in this situation? What do you think we should do when it's time to sit down for the meal? And all things like that. They're quite helpful. Yeah.
No, they're really helpful. And as the child gets used to using them as well, you can start adding things like thought bubbles, which is really useful, so that they can start to understand more what other people were thinking at the time, and they can also say what they were thinking and feeling at the time as well. And I think, I mean, in school we always used to say that all these visual support systems that we must put in place for autistic children are good practice across the board. They're good for all children. So, I mean, I know that some of you might know autistic children, but if you don't, and you want to try things with your own children, they're known to be useful to all children, I think.
Absolutely, yeah. I think there's some really valid points that you came up with there, Hazel, and I recognise some of them, so many of them that I've used with my own grandchildren. I know one of them, you know, if you said to him get dressed when he was younger, he's 11 now, it's okay now, but when he was younger, if you said get dressed, nothing would happen.
No.
But if you said, right, go and put your vest on, go and put your socks on, and gave him the series of instructions, that worked. The thing about using names as well, you know, so many times I'd walk into the room and say, oh, can you put those toys away? And go away, come back, and nothing would have happened, even though he was the only one in the room. But because I hadn't said, Jack, can you go and put those toys away? He didn't realise I was talking to him. So yeah, that's quite a common thing as well that happens. Yeah. So that's absolutely brilliant, and I hope there's been some useful strategies there for anybody to use. And like Hazel said, you know, they're useful for all children, not just a child with autism. It can be used in many situations. I'd just like to talk to you a little bit about some of the sensory differences that somebody with autism can experience. So an autistic person can experience oversensitivity, which is hyper, or undersensitivity, which is hypo, to some of the main senses really that we have. That can include like touch, taste, smells, light, colours, temperatures, and pain as well. So sometimes, you know, an autistic person can experience pain in a very severe way that, you know, we perhaps don't understand. They can find certain background noises like music in a restaurant really distressing, and it can be unbearably loud or distracting for them, and can cause anxiety. One of my grandsons, it used to be a nightmare going in public toilets because he couldn't stand the hot air dryer. And if there were only us going in, that was fine. But obviously, I wouldn't use it. But if other people were using it, it really used to hurt his ears. And I had to kind of, you know, if anybody did, it was like clamp hands over ears and get him out of there as quickly as possible. Many autistic people actually avoid everyday situations because of their sensitivity issues. And schools and workplaces and shops can be overwhelming and cause sensory overload. Many shopping centres, and I know our local cinema, do autism hours now. So a lot of supermarkets will do an autism hour where they perhaps turn down lighting, they don't play the canned music kind of thing. And cinemas quite often will do autistic screenings, so that you can kind of go and they will have certain lighting that's not going to be as distressing. The sound isn't quite as loud. I mean, I find that the sound really loud in cinemas sometimes as well. So somebody who has hypersensitive hearing may find that even harder and even worse than, you know, we perhaps do. So there are 8 sensory systems. I bet you thought there were only 5, didn't you? I did as well until I found out about all this. So there's the ones that we're all aware of. So there's touch, which is a tactile sense, sight, which is visual, the sound, which is auditory, the smell, which is known as olfactory, and there's taste, which is known as gustatory. So the 3 that I wasn't aware of, you may be ahead of me here, is vestibular, and that's about a sense of balance. So quite often, there are a lot of conditions that sometimes go hand in hand with autism, and dyspraxia can be one of them, which is used to be known as the clumsy syndrome, bless. But it's, you know, sometimes it's about not being able to use fine motor skills in the same way, or even gross motor skills in terms of kind of jumping and so on, things like that, because they may have a hyper vestibular system. There's also proprioception, something called proprioception, which is about body spatial awareness. And you sometimes find that people with autism sometimes find it very difficult to have close body contact, or they may not be aware of personal space. So they may also be come and sit right up next to you a lot, and kind of be virtually trying to sit on your knee almost, kind of thing, the whole time. And that's because they're not aware and don't pick up cues from other people that you know, that they might be invading that personal space of somebody else. There's also one it's a fairly new one actually, and that they're still kind of looking into, and this is called interoception. And this is about the ability to detect and attend to internal bodily sensations, such as going to the toilet. So obviously toddlers have very little interoception anyway, but it's something that kind of they develop over time. If you have a child who is kind of not toilet trained, you know, by the age when you would perhaps hope that they would be, certainly by the time they're going to school, it might be worth investigating if they are hyper interoceptive, and they don't have an awareness of the bodily functions that sometimes, you know, we all need to be aware of. So sensory processing, there's 3 stages to kind of how we respond with or how we react with senses. So we receive information. So that might be a sound, it might be a sight, it might be a smell, any of the things. And normally we would receive that, register and pay attention to that sensory information. Then the processing stage, and this is quite often where somebody with autism may have difficulties. They might not be able to prioritize that sensory information. So if they put their hand on something hot, it can take some time before they've actually processed the fact that that's hot and that's going to burn me, that's hurt. And there can they can hurt themselves quicker. And then obviously taking longer to respond. And sometimes there can be kind of a stronger emotional response to these hyper senses that they feel. I'm just going to show you one more, and this is only a very short video clip, but this is about, you may have seen it before, you might not. It's about a young boy in a shopping centre, and he's walking through the shopping centre. I'll just share it and let you watch, and then we'll kind of have a brief discussion on it there.
Six, 7, 8, 9. Take my hand. No, Alex. It's fine, isn't it? It's fine. I'm not naughty. I'm autistic. And I just get too much information.
So you could see from that the overload to the senses that that little boy experienced while walking through the shopping centre. You know, think about kind of the overload on senses, the flashing lights, the sounds, and how amplified they were for the little boy. You know, somebody dropped coins, somebody was slurping a drink, but that to that little boy, to his hyper senses, that was really quite painful for him. And even down to, you know, there was somebody spraying perfume, which, you know, we might not notice, but it kind of, if you wear strong perfume and you notice a reaction sometimes from a child, it can simply be that that is actually something that's painful to them. And also he notices, if you saw in the film, he notices a lot of things very much that we perhaps wouldn't. So, you know, the guy with the black and white hoodie on, and that was very pronounced to him. The shoes, the fact that somebody's laces were unfastened and things like that. And that can be quite a common thing as well. That's and then that, as you saw there, can actually result in a meltdown. And which, you know, you saw kind of the responses of some of the people walking past there, who were just kind of like, oh, you know, that child's behaving really badly there. They're not. That it's a response to an overload to the senses. So I'm aware that was quite a whistle-stop tour of kind of some of the differences that perhaps somebody with autism can experience. I'd just like to kind of tell you briefly a little bit about what GMAC do, and if you're interested in finding out more or coming on to any of the webinars, or as they are at the moment, or maybe the seminars once they become face-to-face again, you can contact GMAC. So I'm just going to give you a couple of bits of information here. So you can contact by email to Abigail, that's ABIGAIL .Gibson, that's GIBSON, at nas.org.uk. You can also phone on 0161 998 04667. And that's to book on to kind of any of the webinars that we have. Or we also have, as I mentioned earlier, the parent drop-in sessions as well that may be helpful to some people. They are for parents of children with autism, but it's also to sometimes just, it's good to share experiences sometimes as well. There's also a couple of websites where you can get more information. So there's the NAS, the National Autistic Society website, which is www.autism.org.uk. And then there's Greater Manchester Autism Consortium, which is www.autismgm.org.uk. So they're also sources of really useful information where you can find out more. I know certainly on the GMAC website, we have booklets around sensory needs, managing anger and understanding autism that are available to parents or any interested parties really to find out more. Was there anything else you wanted to add there, Hazel?
No, I think that covers everything, Kath.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, we hope it's been helpful to you. We hope you've found out quite a bit more about autism there. And, you know, please feel free to give Abby a ring if you want to know any more, if you want any advice on, you know, how to perhaps approach the diagnosis, the road to diagnosis, or any of those areas. And we hope to see you maybe at some point in the future. I think there's going to be a question and answer session shortly after this on via the chat, and Hazel and I will do our best to answer any questions that you may have. Yeah. So it's been lovely talking to you, and I hope to see you soon.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.